Great, thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to speak and for stewarding me through the maze that is your university. I also, till recently I should say, edited a website called New Left Project, which was how I got to know Satnam Verdi, who couldn't be here today, but I understand suggested me as a speaker. So I started actually at Strathclyde University down the road, so it's great to be back in Glasgow and discussing this. And I also, my own research, owed a certain debt of gratitude to the work that's been carried out here, so it's great to be speaking with you at Glasgow University. My research, as that introduction laid out, examined how the end of social democracy in the 1970s and the rise of neoliberalism gradually transformed the BBC. And I'm in a happy position of feeling like the largely historical work that I did has some kind of contemporary relevance, seeing as we're at a stage where the charter renewal is happening next year, which is why I rushed my book out. And we have a government, again, that seems more or less transparently to represent the interests of private media companies, which have been the enemy of the BBC, more or less, ever since it was established. There are a lot of very passionate and committed defenders of the BBC, of which I am one. I think that it needs to be defended as a democratic public institution, as opposed to the private rackets which we have with, sort of symbolised by Rupert Murdoch. So I really sympathise with people who are defending the corporation from the regular attacks it receives. That said, I'd like to speak today from a slightly different perspective and to challenge the way that the BBC has generally been understood in public life. I think that very admirable values which the BBC is thought to embody is sometimes obscured the way what the BBC actually is and what the BBC actually does. So, first of all, I'd like to challenge the conventional understanding of the BBC as an authentically independent organisation. Stuart Hood, who was a socialist and was once head of BBC Television, remarked that the corporation always has the fancy about itself as a totally independent social organisation, and I think that assessment is more or less correct. And secondly, I'd like to argue that I think defenders of the BBC have misunderstood neoliberalism in a quite profound way, in the sense that they've seen neoliberalism too much simplistically as a movement which sought to privatise the BBC, that basically saw public institutions as being bad and private institutions as being good, and associated the attacks on the BBC that more or less begin around the Thatcher period as being a campaign to privatise the BBC. And while it's certainly true that a lot of the people who made up the attacks on the BBC and that coalition of forces that came into ascendancy during the 1980s were interested in privatising the BBC or forcing it to take advertising, I think the vision really from the neoliberals as regards public service broadcasting has been more a programme of instituting a process of marketisation or neoliberalisation. And this really took hold after Thatcherism, and it transformed the BBC in the wake of Thatcherism, particularly under the leadership of John Birt, who I'll be talking about later. And I think in many ways the legacy of Birtism, as it was called, looks to be further consolidated by the current BBC leadership. And Tony Hall, Lord Hall, who's now Director General of the BBC, was very much part of the Birtist revolution. So the BBC, I'm going to start off by giving a bit of background about what the BBC is and give a more or less chronological account, really, of how we got to where we are today, which I hope will give a sense of what the BBC is and how it's become what it is today. So the BBC was founded in 1922. It actually started off as a coalition of radio manufacturers, the 6 big manufacturers. And they had the product which they basically wanted to monetize, to commercialize, which was the technology of the radio transmitters, the actual wirelesses that they were selling people. What they didn't have was anything to broadcast to their consumers. So what they wanted to do was to get a product They wanted to be able to sell something to encourage people to buy radios. So that's what the corporations wanted. And in protracted negotiations with the post office, which basically controlled the communicative infrastructure of the British state and the British nation, if you like, and the empire, they formed the British Broadcasting Company, which was founded in 1922, October 1922, and it was given a license, a monopoly over broadcasting in 1923 by the post office. And essentially what happens is later, after the general strike in 1926, which I'm going to talk about shortly, it becomes a public corporation, and it takes on a sort of national significance. It's one of the first public corporations. The BBC originally isn't sort of that into news. I mean, I'm mainly going to be talking about news and current affairs journalism today, so I think it's important to say that the BBC obviously does a lot more than that, but what I'm going to be focusing on is the explicitly political parts, and as far as that goes for the BBC, that was limited at the beginning by the newspapers. And what happens, and the wire services, who basically lobby the government to restrict the BBC's broadcasting because they thought it would threaten their commercial interests. So what happens is, in 1926, when the ban gets lifted during the course of the general strike, the newspapers disappear as a result of the strike, and there's two sources of information, one of which is the BBC and the other of which is the official government. I think it was called the British Gazette, I'm not quite sure, but basically it was a newspaper run by Churchill, which was a propaganda outfit. And this is the guy, J.C.C. Davison, who headed the government's PR operation during the general strike, and he was the liaison guy with the BBC. And he describes and he talked about the politically uneducated electorate and the threat that they pose to our strength in the country. He was very much, he was a reactionary, he was a propagandist. And he asserted during the general strike what he called his unofficial control of the BBC. He happened to live next door to John Reith, who was the managing director of the British Broadcasting Company, later the Director General. And Reith and his various other senior officials, once the ban on news has been lifted, move into the Admiralty, which, you've got to think the Admiralty there is more or less the equivalent of the Pentagon today. It's the centre, the military centre of the British Empire. And this guy was chief engineer, Peter Eckersley, and he describes here what happened while he was disseminating news. My job was to sort out as news came in, hickledy-pickledy, and arrange items under headings. My tidy sheets were sent to the Admiralty, where, so we gathered, government censors would pass it for broadcasting. I therefore shared with a few others the staggering experience of comparing all the news as it came in with that which was considered fit for public consumption. Many of those besides myself who had been proselytising the BBC as an impartial public servant were bitterly disappointed. It was not so much that the news was altered as given bias by elimination. A famous episode during the general strike is when the Archbishop of Canterbury wants to broadcast and say that the trade union should negotiate with the government, and he's banned from broadcasting by John Reith. And instead they allow the Archbishop of Westminster, who's the equivalent Catholic, head of the Catholic Church in the UK, to broadcast, because he said that the general strike was a sin against God. So this is it's widely acknowledged in the media histories that the BBC didn't live up to its impartiality during the general strike. Reith famously commented that we know that the government know that they cannot trust us to be really impartial. This is the announcement that the BBC that John Reith personally made once the general strike had finished. He said, our first feeling on hearing the termination of the strike must be a profound thankfulness to Almighty God who has led us through this supreme trial with national health unimpaired. You've heard the messages from the King and the Prime Minister. It remains me only to add, that the conviction that the nation's happy escape has been in large measure due to the personal trust in the Prime Minister. I mean, the extent of collaboration actually between the senior levels of the BBC and the politicians has been really underplayed actually in a lot of the accounts. I mean, Reeve actually wrote speeches for the Prime Minister during the general strike. And right at the end of the strike, after Reeve gives this announcement, he reads out William Blake's poem And Did Those Feet in Ancient Times, which was actually kind of ironic because Blake was a supporter of the French Revolution. But of course it became a sort of patriotic national anthem hymn during the First World War. And he read out the poem on air. He described this as a little thing of our own in his memoirs. And he reads out the words to Jerusalem. And as he read out the words, an orchestra played the score in the background, and the last verse was repeated by the BBC choir. So this gives you a sense of the kind of way in which impartiality was construed at that stage. And after the strike, he sends out a highly confidential letter to his staff, and he refers with pride to the Prime Minister's gratifying trust in the company's loyalty and judgment. And the staff reply with a memorandum to him, thanking him for his magnificent leadership, which they say has carried through the BBC through the crisis, with its prestige not only maintained but greatly increased. I think this illustrates the ambiguous position that the BBC found itself in at that stage. At this point, it was in a very uncertain position, negotiating its future, and the BBC has more or less remained in that position ever since. I mean, on the one hand, it's very clear that senior people within the BBC, like most of all Reeve himself and his circle of gentlemen, sympathise massively with the government, but also they were kept clearly subordinated to the government. And it's important that J.C.C. Davison, who I mentioned earlier, was seen as one of the moderates in the cabinet. He wanted to basically keep the BBC officially independent on the understanding that if they nationalised it or took it directly under government control, which is what Churchill favoured, the people would no longer trust it, and therefore it wouldn't be very useful. So there's this sort of strategic meeting between the people at the head of the BBC who want to make themselves useful to senior figures within the state in order to assist them, in order to establish their place within the establishment, and the more, let's say, strategically minded political figures who realise it's better actually to keep the BBC in this kind of place of ambiguous autonomy. This gives you a pretty, if you had any doubt, this was a comment by John Reeve, founder of the BBC, who says pretty explicitly that he wanted the BBC to be part of the establishment. So the question then becomes, to what extent did the BBC later move away from this position which it found itself in? And I think actually this is quite a good quite a revealing statement. I think this is Charles Curran, I believe, who was Director General of the BBC in the 1970s. He was quite a conservative figure, actually. I'll talk about his predecessor as much more liberal. But he says the BBC is a creature of the establishment, depends on the extent of the establishment for its continuance of being. But its activities are by their very nature, which is to ask questions constantly open to the accusation of being subversive. I think that's a pretty accurate account of what the BBC is and the position it has always found itself in. So this was his predecessor. His name is Hugh Green, and he headed the BBC for much of the 1960s. And at this point, the BBC changes significantly. Stuart Hood, who I quoted earlier, says that the BBC programmes for the first time attacked some of the sacred cows of the establishment, the monarchy, the church, leading politicians, other previously taboo targets. So it breaks with the sort of traditional deference which the BBC has adopted. And Green himself claims that the BBC is, quote, no longer appealing to the establishment, says it was reshaped by a younger generation. And this is correct. I mean, the BBC was attacked during this period by conservative figures like Mary Whitehouse and her National Viewers and Listeners Association, and she blamed the BBC for the sort of liberal turmoils and radicalism of the 1960s, you know, the death of deference, breakdown of family values, and all the other things which they were complaining about. I mean, more or less saw the BBC as a sort of zeitgeist liberal institution which was imposing its liberalism on the public. But Green himself actually is a much more ambiguous figure than that. I mean, this is a statement he makes about which then gets used to distance the BBC, to take a critical position on apartheid, which actually is later rolled back in various documents during the 1970s. I mean, Green more or less says that we can't be impartial about racism. And his successors get very uncomfortable about that, and they start to roll back from that position. I don't really have time to talk about that too much. But his position on apartheid and racism was probably the more radical end of his ethos of broadcasting. I mean, this programme, That Was the Week That Was, is very sort of celebrated in media histories, is much more representative of the sort of thing which the BBC was doing. A satirical programme which was very deferent towards politicians and was very criticised. I mean, one Conservative Party member called it left-wing socialists and pacifists. Edward Heath blamed it for the death of deference. And Green himself said that it became a symbol of the new-look BBC. It was frank, close to life, analytical, impatient of taboos, cant, and often very funny. I think it's very easy to exaggerate the significance of this. Actually, it's quite revealing as to the limitations of this kind of politics, because what actually happens with That Was the Week That Was they didn't expect it to be popular, they didn't expect it to get the kind of audiences that it did. And it's regularly discussed by the Board of Governors in the early 1960s. And when one governor says it was wearing a little fin in Westminster circles, threatens to resign, and Green unilaterally axes the programme. And that's where that ended. Tom Burns, who was a sociologist who studied the BBC in the 1960s, said that a lot of the people in the BBC were very uncomfortable with the style of the programme. They said it was amateurish and unprofessional and all of the rest of it. I think another element which is worth going back to Green and the 60s period is that we now know that the Green push for MI5 to expand the vetting of its staff at this stage, all BBC staff, not all BBC staff, but all the BBC staff are working more or less all of them in current affairs or any editorial positions, as well as in arts and dramas, and a large section of the BBC staff were vetted by MI5. And if you were considered to be a subversive, then you wouldn't be employed. We know from declassified files that it wasn't actually just MI5 that it wasn't the state imposing this on the BBC. Actually, senior figures within the BBC themselves wanted to expand vetting and keep communists out of the BBC.
But were they actually themselves critically members of MI5? The members within the BBC, was there any evidence that they were themselves actually agents of MI5?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I've actually been trying to research this myself. There's definitely evidence of people in this generation have a lot of intelligence connections in the 1960s. So going back to Hugh Green, he worked originally in broadcasting in Eastern Europe, and he was basically an anti-communist propagandist. Let me see, I think I've actually got this in my notes somewhere, if you just give me a sec. So he called himself a journalist and psychological warrior, and his role there was to pillory the communist regime and display it as being ridiculous as well as cynical and evil. I mean, Green's brother and sister were both in MI6, for example. I mean, I have some anecdotal evidence which is very difficult to corroborate that there were definitely MI6 people in the BBC at this time. MI5, they had a guy in the BBC who basically worked for the head of personnel who liaised with MI5 over employment. But he was himself a lot of former military people. So Green then later, after that, he goes to work for Howard Briggs in a counterinsurgency campaign in Malaya. He's his head of propaganda there, and that's where Britain laid the groundwork for a lot of the what America did in Vietnam in terms of like that whole notion of hearts and minds and combining propaganda with military strategies were all developed there in Malaya, and Green was part of that. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any.
I had in mind a Radio 4 documentary, I guess 2 years ago.
Document program.
Which was basically looking at the infiltration of Fleet Street
So
by the Secret Services.
Yeah, I mean, there was a document that in the 1960s, the Soviets published a document purporting to be a list of, this wasn't MI5, but it was MI6, that program. The Soviets published a document claiming to reveal that the British journalists working for MI6, and it had a list which seems to be more or less corroborated. And there were BBC people on that list. I mean, I forget the name of, I think it was someone called Leonard Smith, something like that. But I've not seen the original documents. But I mean, the BBC is very closely connected to those sort of channels. I mean, so Ian Trefalwyn, who's Director General in the 1980s, he spikes the Panorama programme quite famously in cooperation with the intelligence services. The same thing happens with the War Games, which was a programme about nuclear war that the the government was worried would create sympathy for the C&D. The BBC spiked that programme and then publicly says they haven't had any discussion with government, which of course serves both their interests because the BBC gets to look like it's made a decision itself. The government doesn't look like it's twisted the BBC's arm. Anyway, I'm going to have to go a bit quicker. The golden age, if you like, under Green, where the BBC takes more of a liberal turn, I think takes a more conservative turn in the 1970s. This starts with a guy called Lord Hill, who's appointed by Harold Wilson. This is actually Swan. He's Lord Hill's successor. And Hill introduced a whole series of changes. He brings in McKinsey, which was a management consultancy, a very big management consultancy company, introduces a lot of managerial reforms, and reform some of the journalistic processes and the way the BBC is organised. And it's very unpopular, it's resisted by a lot of staff, and I think it sort of foreshadows stuff that happens later under John Birt. He produces a document. Ian Trefalwyn, who's later Director General, produced a document called Broadcasting in the 1970s, which was very unpopular. His successor, Michael Swan, was a very conservative figure as well. I mean, he very explicitly wanted to curtail the influence of 60s radicalism at the BBC. He launched at the Institute for Economic Affairs, which is the fact-right think tank. I don't know how much you all know about that. He corresponded with Mary Whitehouse relatively sympathetically. If anyone, by the way, if anyone doesn't know like what I'm talking about, if I mention names or organisations, do stop and interrupt. I'm perfectly happy to do that, for you to do that. This is interesting. This is from a file where Michael Swan meets with Harold Wilson, and he talks about fighting hippie influence at the corporation, which of course means like the influence of 60s radicalism and liberal culture. And he says he thought too many young producers approached every programme from the starting point of attitude about the subject, which could be summed up as Euroshit. It was an attitude which he and others in the management of the BBC, he mentions Hugh Weldon, deplored, and they would be using their influences as opportunity offered to try and counter it. Hugh Weldon was himself, I don't know if he was connected to intelligence, but he was part of that sort of private anti-communist networks, and he was connected to the neoconservatives. He was very good friends with Norman Proderitz. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but so yeah, I mean, he was part of these sort of new right networks, as was Michael Swan. This is from a BBC file from 1979, where they're actually discussing the aftermath of the so-called winter of discontent. There's a whole generation now in journalism and politics who, in their days in London School of Economics, grown up to believe that the BBC was fascist and everything else that was bad. There was a whole sort of movement against the BBC, or at least against the idea that the BBC was impartial in the 1970s. You had people like the Glasgow University Media Group here, you had the Birmingham Centre, trade unionists and academics producing for the first time very critical studies of the BBC, and a kind of movement for media form of which the late Tony Benn became something of a figurehead. He famously said in the late 60s, broadcasting is too important to be left to the broadcasters.
This picture, quickly, that's Annie Cally did a young version.
That's right, yeah. That's the London School of Economics, I think, the march from there. And that's Vanessa Redgrave, I think, in the background. This, again, is from a file discussing the winter of discontent. Everyone will recognise this, British spots recognise that picture in the the background of the rubbish piling up, which is, of course, when everyone realised that Britain was on the wrong track and we needed to embrace Thatcherism. And this is bad news, the Glasgow University Media Group's seminal study. So they're discussing their coverage of the winter of discontent, and so the BBC had to understand it could not win on this issue. It was inevitable, given the history of the trade union movement, that it would be seen as we would be seen as an establishment organisation. What was sad, however, was that a publication such as Bad News by the Glasgow University Media Group was being quoted as a work of authority. It was shocking. I think if you go back to the 1970s, there was a reaction against a lot of the criticisms which the BBC was receiving from people like Greg, the Glasgow Group, but also they were trying to resist the trade unions and the sort of new radical culture that had broader in British society. So with Swan trying to curtail radicalism, he expanded referring up, which was a process whereby anything that was seen as politically controversial, you had to, ask the man upstairs, and it would work its way up the BBC hierarchy. You have all kinds of documents produced about what impartiality means and what good journalism means, and you see a kind of defensive reaction against the criticism which the BBC has received. But I think also it's interesting going back to that file about Wilson and Michael Swan, sort of feeling a certain amount of solidarity between them, because of course Wilson was himself battling the left in the Labour Party at the same time as Swan is battling the legacies of the left within the BBC. And Wilson himself, sort of an ambiguous figure in terms of where he stood in Labour history and the left, was responsible for appointing Lord Hill in the late 1960s, which I think is one of the key sort of turning points in BBC history. So the way in which, one of the key themes, if you look back on these 1970s documents, is this kind of notion that impartiality should be construed in a certain kind of way. And that was more or less in orientation to the institutes of Parliament. The way in which the BBC understood impartiality was closely tied to the institutions of the British state. So there was a discussion paper in 1975 called How Should We Broadcast News and Current Affairs? And it stated, of course, the BBC totally accepts the need to support and maintain parliamentary democracy. Another document stated the parliamentary democracy involved in this country is a work of national genius to be upheld and preserved. And it links it to the BBC's constitutional role as a supplier of news and information. There was a document called The Broadcasting of News in the United Kingdom, which said that BBC journalists still aim to uphold the same qualities of honesty, accuracy, responsibility and independence that they did during the Second World War. Actually, the BBC was more or less controlled by the British state during the Second World War. They are qualities to which journalists in parliamentary democracies have been taught to aim for the public good and sometimes at considerable cost to themselves for generation after generation. Such responsible journalism rests on the belief that society will, for the institutions of Parliament, cure itself of ills which are brought to its attention. I mean, I think it's important to note that at this stage, a lot of the radical movements on the left were trying to get past what was seen as the limitations of these institutions. Extra parliamentary activism, radicalism outside the Labour Party, direct action, of course, anti-racist struggles. This is where the action was in the 1970s. And the BBC at this point is taking a fairly conservative position, which makes perfect sense because it's tied, through its institutionally in terms of its and materially in terms of its funding to parliamentary democracy, or let's say senior figures within the British state. So these are two more quotes. We're living in a parliamentary democracy, or else the BBC could not exist. It's saying it's in the BBC's self-interest, basically. The one on the right is another one from 1973-74, which is when the miners seemed to be threatening civilization, basically, by going on strike and brought down the Edward Heath's government. They say members of the BBC News staff are not impartial in the least, although they say they are. They're greatly in favour of parliamentary democracy and will continue to be so, and will continue to report honestly and without prejudice what is going on in the country. So they're basically putting the people's mind at ease that they are biased in favour of parliamentary democracy. This is by a guy called Desmond Taylor, who was then head of BBC journalism, editor of News and Current Affairs. He was one of the senior figures in the BBC, who regularly received from that year, I think, a report called Survey of Subversive Activities from MI5, which I recall correctly went to him and the Director General, and it later gets expanded. So that's another element of the intelligence connections. Okay, so there's sort of a conservative turn in the leadership of the BBC in the 1970s, but it's really in the 1980s that I think the liberal and radical culture, which changed a lot of the journalism at the BBC, gets curtailed in a much more satisfactory way from their perspective, let's say. So you had a network of people in the 1980s who attacked the BBC. They obviously included Thatcher herself. That's Norman Tebbit to her right there, and of course Rupert Murdoch, whose papers. Of course, the rise of Thatcherism coincided with a rightward shift in the private media and the press, and of course there was a coalition between Thatcher and Murdoch, and Murdoch was very committed to neoliberalism, sort of populist neoliberalism that Thatcher was articulating. On the bottom left here, that's Hayek. And the head of research and I think chairman, if I got the position right, at the Institute for Economic Affairs, which was the primary neoliberal think tank in the UK, which influenced Thatcherism. And on the right there, Alan Peacock, he was involved in the Institute for Economic Affairs, and he was also influenced by public choice theory, which I'm going to talk about in a bit. But he's appointed by Thatcher to review the funding of the BBC and the licence fee, and it's kind of hoped that he's going to rule that the BBC should take advertising, which is what Thatcher wants. Actually, for various reasons, that doesn't really happen. I mean, the neoliberals and the neoliberal intellectuals, the people who make up the Peacock inquiry, more or less say that if we have advertising, that won't actually deliver consumers what they want, which is, the ideology is what neoliberalism is supposed to do. So instead of doing that, they make a move towards subscription services. But what they do is they recommend that part of BBC's programming comes from the private sector. And this sets in train a process of commercialisation that gradually starts to transform the BBC. And one of the important figures in this is this guy here, who's John Birt, and he joins the corporation as the Deputy Director General in 1987. So Alistair Milne, who basically gets fired by the chairman, who was a Thatcher appointee, who was seen as representing the old kind of programme maker style, and the BBC had produced a lot of very critical programmes during the 1980s, and the relationship with the government goes very bad, and this then leads to Alistair Milne being fired. And then the new Director General, Michael Checkland, who is an accountant, says he's going to bring the BBC's finances under control, because at the same time as the BBC is being attacked for its kind of left-wing bias, it's also being attacked on the basis that its finances are out of control, that it needs to be disciplined in terms of its spending and all of the rest of it. So you'll all be familiar with those neoliberal arguments. So Checkland appoints Birt his deputy. Now, John Birt, at that stage, he worked at LWT, so he was for Channel 3, and the BBC's commercial rival. At that stage, there was no Channel 4, so that was the only other organisation. London Weekend Television, that was, I think. And he headed a programme called Weekend World, and the main presenter of that is this guy, Peter Jay, who was the economics editor for The Times, and he was a monetarist journalist who had been sent out to America by his editor, and had come back and spread neoliberal ideas at his pages. And he was very close to another guy called Sam Britton, who worked at the Financial Times, and they both popularised neoliberal ideas in the press. And when at Weekend World, they became very close to the neoliberal movement. So Peter Jay was basically Birt's presenter on that program. And they have people like Sam Britton and Alan Budd and Terry Burns. These are figures, neoliberal economists on their programs at the same time as these people couldn't really get access to the BBC. And so Birt goes to the Institute of Economic Affairs. He lunches with Keith Joseph, who was, the head of the New Right. So he's moving in these kind of circles. And this quote here is him describing more or less his politics, really. So he says, "I've met some of the sharpest, best-informed minds in the country. Two people in particular, Peter Jay and Terry Burns, I mentioned them, had a profound impact on my thinking. I become a convert to free market mechanisms. I was deeply sceptical that the state could run business. I abhorred the ugly abuse of power by trade unions, not least in my own industry. I could see that my unthinking conviction in the 1960s that the state could solve every problem, that public spending could rise and rise, was ill-founded." So he arrives at the BBC in 1970, basically a convert, in his own words, to the values of the market. He says he's hostile to vested interests, and his experience at LWT had taught him the importance of driving through change against heavy resistance. So he introduces, first of all, he's there to reform journalism. He had had a sort of philosophy of journalism, which I'll try not to spend too much time on, but basically Peter Jay and him had this idea that you needed more expertise because journalism was kind of adversarial and it was storytelling, and actually what you needed was sort of highbrow analysis so that people could figure out what was going on wrong in the world and people could sort of develop sensible solutions. So that's a very highbrow, analytical and very dull approach to program making, which was he was very committed to, and he wrote a series of articles in the Times at that time. And this is more or less what he does at the BBC. He restructures it. He combines news and current affairs. He brings in lots of people from the private sector, and he says that he reforms and modernises it. He calls it an uncontrolled Leviathan, and he introduces rigorous procedures for monitoring particularly sensitive programmes. He centralises news and programme scripts are vetted. So James Long, who I interviewed for my thesis, describes how one of the things that really bothered me was an increase towards script approval. I won't get the whole quote because I want to move on, but more or less, it was literally you would have to send in what you were going to report, and it would go through an editorial process, and you'd then be told that that isn't correct or that isn't the story. Now, so he reforms all of journalism, and that was under pressure from the Thatcher government and the attacks that had been made on the BBC's reporting, a lot of which was over war. But when it comes to the 1990s, he introduces basically a very radical managerial reform at the BBC, which was called producer choice, and it was basically an internal market, and an internal market being introduced in the NHS. And what producer choice did was it meant that if you're making programs and you wanted to have some resources to make that program, say your research and you want a book on something, you don't just go to the BBC library and ask for that book. You give money to the BBC library for borrowing the book, and then each unit within the BBC had to basically cut even. So that meant that the library essentially trades with other units within the BBC, right? So that everybody has their own accounts, and you had to cut even. So it meant that, and crucially, they had to compete with external providers. So if I wanted some resources for a program, I could either go to a BBC provider or I could go to an external provider. Now, this system gets introduced at the same time as the external quota gets introduced. So it's part of the BBC being integrated into the market. What happens, the idea really behind...
Who are those quotes from, John?
I'll come on to that.
They're obviously not Birt, are they? So.
They're not, no. Well, okay, so what happens is he introduces this market which was supposed to bring greater efficiency and freedom and all of the rest of it. The middle one is actually from a quotation in the newspaper. There was a lot of public criticism of producer choice as being this kind of irrational system that prevented creativity and brave journalism. So Birt's the first one. The BBC became a trading organisation and ceased to be a command economy. So he does conceive of these things in very neoliberal terms. He sees the BBC more or less as a kind of state leviathan, and that he wants to introduce market-based thinking. He introduces what he calls the cultural change program. He spread of business-like practices. So it's a very explicit ideological program, which I don't think was really recognised as such at the time. He was seen. Sorry, my phone just beeped. He was seen as this kind of maniac managerial figure, and none of this was really recognised as being a neoliberal program. The last quote, Greg, was from the BBC Review. So Coopers and Lybrand, who were, I can't remember which accountancy firm they are now, but accountancy firms get more and more consolidated until there's a big four or the big five, I don't remember which, but I think it later becomes part of PricewaterhouseCoopers, but I'm not really sure. But Birt brings in all of these private sector managers, like McKinsey and Company that did the 60s review, and Coopers and Lybrand, and they do a review of what had happened under producer choice, and that was one of their findings. There was a unanimous view that there's been a huge increase in the volume of transactions to the point of unmanageability. So what was supposed to be to bring efficiency had actually the review said. I'll give you some other quotes here. So there's the Director of Finance and Technology reports that there's a concern under producer choice is characterised at least by anecdotal comment, by paper overload, bureaucracy, needless volumes of transaction, and undue complexity. There's increased workload. This is from the evaluation study, including reporting, administration, negotiation, contracting. Goodwill has been stretched almost to breaking point. Another document noted the increase in paperwork, and this is the quote here, the unanimous view that there had been a huge increase in the volume of transactions. And this was all despite Birt's promise that it would cut out bureaucracy and devolve power, those are the quotes. And Michael Starks, who was the man responsible for implementation, said it would be the BBC would be managed straightforwardly with minimum bureaucracy and reduced tiers of administration and streamlined decision-making. What actually happened was there was a huge increase in accountants and policy staff and bureaucrats, basically, at the expense of program makers. I think one of the things, as I mentioned, was that a lot of this was seen as this kind of, although it was understood to be part of the kind of modern obsession with management ideology, a lot of it wasn't really recognised as actually being, I think, as being basically a neoliberal project. I mentioned earlier that Birt was part of the neoliberal movement, and Birt himself says that Birt himself says that this is all management science. This isn't political. People said this was part of Thatcherism, but actually it was all technocratic. Now, there's a really interesting study called by a woman called Sonia Amadei, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, called Rationalising Capitalist Democracy. And what she does is she describes how rational choice theory, which is always assumed to be part of neoclassical economics, actually has really deep roots in the Rand Corporation. And Elaine Enthoven, who was a Rand analyst, who worked with... I'll come back to who he worked with, but he was responsible for proposing the internal market, which later the BBC gets modelled on. Actually, the guy who ran the pilot study for the internal market in the NHS was married to a woman called Jenny Abramsky, who was a very senior figure in the BBC at this time. And when Birt implements it, he goes through that channel. But there's a bunch of people here. I don't really have time to go through this in much detail, but there's quite an interesting history. What happens is, there's a bunch of people who work in the Rand Corporation, very clever mathematicians and economists, and Kenneth Arrow is quite a key figure. He comes up with this theory he writes a book called Social Choice and Individual Values. He's recruited by Rand. Does everyone know what Rand is, by the way? So Rand is a think tank which was established by after the Second World War by the US Air Force, and it creates a lot of the rationale for nuclear confrontation. That's what it's best known for. Sorry? Pre what? I think 48. I think it's founded, but it basically emerges, if you like, out of the military-industrial complex of the Second World War. So, when the United States goes into the Second World War, they bring in a lot of scientists and intellectuals, of course, as part of the war effort, and this was kind of a legacy of that. RAND stands for Research and Development, but actually what they did was a lot of intellectual work around nuclear confrontation using game theory. And what a lot of the intellectuals they had developed using game theory modelling was this idea that we're all isolated individuals who all have sort of set preferences. And what Kenneth Arrow did was he developed a proof which later gave rise to this idea of social choice, which was the idea that if you had 3 people, that's the minimum amount of people, with a set of ranked preferences, it was impossible to arrive at a rational outcome on the basis of that, which basically meant, I mean, he had a mathematical proof around this, but basically the consequence of this is that he was saying that you couldn't have a form of just democratic decision-making on the basis of a collective, right? So he develops that in his book, Social Choice and Individual Values. I mean, ironically, actually, it would apply equally to the market, but it becomes kind of, Rand was very much part of the Cold War, and a lot of these intellectuals are working in a sort of anti-communist and some of them kind of anti-Keynesian kind of context. And the people who run with this idea are James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, who founded a school called Public Choice, which was basically applying this kind of game theory, decision-making, rational choice to politics. So the idea was that you look at politics not as a process of public negotiation over how you want society to run, but as a series of, or even as a set of ideals, but as a set of self-interested groups who basically jostle for favour. These ideas around public choice and transaction cost economics, rational choice institutional economics, Reynold Krauss, who was at LSE, who's in the top right, come together around what's called new public management, which is basically Birtism is kind of a variety of that, which applies game theory. And there's a guy called William Niskanen, I can't really go into because I don't have time, but he was also quite important in developing public choice theory. And the reason I'm going into this history is that I think, in a way, neoliberalism has been slightly understood as being a free market idea. The idea that if you get rid of the state, then we will all suddenly start trading with each other and be good neoliberals. Actually, most of the neoliberals didn't really think like that. I mean, even Hayek, he thought that we all naturally would get on with each other if we were sort of left to our own devices. And what was necessary to do was to set up an institutional framework in which we'd all compete, because everyone knows that's the best way to run society. But this way of thinking was most developed in the public choice school and also German Ordo neoliberalism. But the idea was that you set up an institutional framework in which you can establish competition, and you can more or less force people to, or let's say incentivize people to act how you want them to act. And I think Birtism needs to be understood as a variety of that. I mean, you get a lot of studies that come out around the time of Birtism. Michael Power, who I think himself was actually worked at Cooper's Lybrand, called it the Audit Society. You got this huge increase in bureaucracy, exactly the time at which you were supposed to be people are supposed to be set free from the sort of shackles of the state and all of the rest of it. James Buchanan did a book on anarchism with his public choice people and said that man is and should remain a slave to the state. I mean, that's kind of the conclusion that they came to. Market Stalinism. I mean, it's interesting. There's a guy called Ronald Aman, and he was a sociologist of the Soviet political economy, and he wrote a piece in the early 1990s about this kind of infrastructure of auditing and incentives and reviews and all of the rest of the stuff, which you'll probably all be familiar with from if you worked in the public sector or in a university. And he remarked that many of the aspects of overall mode of political management and control are disturbingly similar not least in the prevailing ideological narrative that represents this form of managerialism as a form of individual empowerment. This quote is from a guy called Mark Fisher, who I think is very interesting, but he more or less makes the same point, really, that if you look at actually existing neoliberalism as opposed to what is claimed for it, it's perfectly normal to have this huge increase in bureaucracy and in audits and in management and accountants and all the rest of it. So this idea, that neoliberalism is going to set us free is obviously empirically not the case. I need to skip to, there's an anthropologist, Georgina Bourne, who describes what happens as a result of Birtism at the BBC. And she says, the installation throughout the BBC, the result was a new culture of entrepreneurialism. The Birt era reforms, according to Bourne, generated a new value system, and the BBC became infatuated with markets. So my argument, basically, which is quite difficult for me to outline in this relatively short space of time, and I appreciate I've gone on a bit, is that the cultural change programme more or less transformed the BBC. It really broke up some of those values which the BBC had kind of embedded, and particularly institutional loyalty to the BBC. I mean, there was a real casualisation of the labour force. The notion that you're all supposed to be trading and reflecting business values was really seen as eroding the vision of what the BBC was, which was a kind of institution which would offer a place to do journalism and creative work and cultural work without the pressures and ideology of the market. Now, before I conclude, I need to say a few words about business journalism, because this is the other part of my thesis, which I don't really have time to talk about very much. But at the same time as these organisational reforms were going through in the 1990s, a series of changes also take place at the BBC. I'm going to start with just an anecdote on this point. Yesterday morning, BBC Radio 4's flagship news and current affairs programme Today ran a piece asking whether the Conservative Party could legitimately claim to be the party of working people. And Michelle Hussain travelled to Bury in Greater Manchester and spoke to a man who ran a lettings company in the town. This is how the report went. Phil Collett set up his lettings business Belvoir 2 years ago, taking advantage of a government scheme designed to support new small businesses. It's done better than he ever hoped. He now has 1,100 properties on his books and employs 15 people. So Phil Collett told the reporter that the 75% government loan he'd received made it all possible. He couldn't have done it without it. He said, a Conservative supporter, and added, I do believe that they are for the working people. So, who was this budding entrepreneur? Phil Collett is a buy-to-let landlord. He describes himself as an investment landlord with properties from Wigan to Stockport. And for 13 years, he managed a franchise Vauxhall dealership. He opened up a branch of Belvoir, with funds backed by the government's enterprise fund guarantee scheme, as well as £20,000 from the franchise. So Belvoir gave him money for that. And then later, Belvoir gave him £250,000 to acquire another lettings agency in the town. So the BBC's approach at this point, the first thing they did when they were trying to find out, was the Conservative Party a friend of the working people, was to approach somebody who worked in business. And this may seem absurd, but there was a whole process of change that took place at the BBC that started in the 1990s with a kind of technocratic economists, symbolised by people like Peter Jay, who I mentioned earlier, and Evan Davis, who's still at the BBC, who were sort of denying that economics had anything to do with interest. It was all about properly running the economy. And then you had a separate strain of that, which was sort of business populism. It was the idea that we'd all become, little entrepreneurs, and that we'd all become fascinated with markets and all the rest of it. And the job was to go out there and report on that. And an important change came with Greg Dyke, who was Director General from 1999, who appointed a right-wing journalist called Jeff Randall. Anyway, I can't go too much into that, but just to give you a sense of how things changed, in the 1970s, You had Labour journalists who reported regularly on trade unions, I mean, mainly sort of badgering them over whether they go on strike or not. But at least the unions were seen as a legitimate part of the body politics, let's say. The BBC TVs at that news industrial editor at that stage had 3 correspondents, and the radio had around half a dozen or so specialist staff. 2 decades later, the BBC had a 24-hour tri-media operation of around 160 journalists and support staff, producing 11 hours of business programme every week. I mean, more important than this, I think, is that the BBC started to treat business, and actually Peter Jay, to his credit, actually resisted this, started to treat business as if it could just be used as a word for any sort of facet of economic life, you know. And any notion of people being a worker just completely disappeared from the BBC's business coverage. There were lots of factors behind this. First of all, very business. It was an explicit political programme from the heads of the BBC, from the Director General down, and sympathetic staff. The wider political economy, the media change became more internationalised. Business was obviously very useful for private media companies in terms of their advertising income, and also, I think, as papers like The Guardian and The Independent, the liberal papers, got a windfall from the commercialisation of financial products in the 1980s. They create all of these things, and of course the shift to the right of the Labour Party created this kind of common sense that kind of cascades through the BBC and down the BBC, to the point that now it's extremely business friendly. Mike Berry, who I think was at this university at one stage, offered a study of Radio 4 Today after 2008, when the financial crisis hit, and found that representatives from financial services companies made up 35.1% of all source appearances, and organised labour made up only 0.4%. Okay, I'm going to conclude because I've gone slightly over the 3/4 hour I was told to do, but just a few sort of concluding points. I mean, I think it should be clear enough that the BBC has always been, at best, a sort of quasi-state organisation. It's the governors are all political appointees. It's always been very close to Westminster. Its notion of impartiality has always been developed in closely to politicians. But today, it's not just part of the establishment, but part of the neoliberal business-orientated establishment. I think its capacity for public-spirited journalism has been hugely eroded by the process of change that it went through during the 1990s and the 2000s as well, which there aren't really any signs of that having been reversed. I mean, those who hope that 2008 might bring about some sort of change in the BBC's business reporting. I mean, the evidence suggests that actually that wasn't the case. I mean, there was another study which Cardiff carried out for the BBC Trust that found that the amount of business sources increased quite a lot between 2007 and 2012. So actually, paradoxically, the crash was really good for BBC business journalists, because if people wanted them on, they were the people in the BBC, the go-to people, the economists, if you like, to explain what was going on. And of course, the way in which they construed their job, the way in which the resources were allocated, the way in which you could get on air, had already been set through that key period. And I think, just to conclude, the reason I took a sort of historical approach to this is to emphasise that this has been the result. The BBC today is the result of explicit sometimes political struggle by business interests and the conservative movement. And I think those committed to egalitarian and radical change in society need to bear that in mind. If you feel fatalistic about the BBC, it still holds the promise for a different sort of media, a public democratic media. And but I think, if we're serious about meeting that challenge of creating that, I think defenders of the BBC need to be much more ambitious, and they need to look forward rather than back. I don't think defending Reithian values or really public service broadcasting in the old tradition is going to be a very useful way forward. All right, I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, Tom, for this great expose. when you started talking about the restructure, I just had this traumatized memory of what happened to us here in the university. I'm afraid these long moments of recognition of the template that, as you say, exists in many sectors. And I think I found the title for your book.
Yeah.
The state you quoted, A Little Thing of Our Own.
Yeah.
That was a good. Was that read from?
That was really, that was for the end of the general strike. That was his ad-libbing, thanking the king and country.
Oh, think about it. Anyway, can I invite questions or comments?
I'd like to ask you about your views on BBC's behaviour during the Scottish independence referendum. And I'd like to throw in some context. So, for example, I was struck by Nick Robinson's picture there under the banner Impartiality and Parliamentarism, because of his famous BBC coverage of Alex Salmon's press conference, where he essentially stated, as I recall, he didn't answer in relation to a question he posed. That was his coverage of Alex Salmon's response, something that he subsequently kind of apologised for, but it was symptomatic. The other sort of context, and it relates to the bad news reference to the Glasgow University book. There's been several outputs, academic outputs, on the BBC's coverage. One of them was from John Robertson from the University of West of Scotland. I'd be interested if you had seen his report, not only the content of it, but how the BBC treated him. It was an interesting example of the BBC's reaction to data. There's also G.A. Ponsonby, which may be a pseudonymous book, How the BBC Stole the Referendum, available from any good bookstore. And one of the important quotes that he draws upon is Paul Mason, former BBC journalist, who stated, actually tweeted, "Not since the Iraq War has he seen the BBC News working at propaganda strength like this, so I'm glad to be out of there." So, with all of that.
Yeah. I mean, look, I didn't, I can't really sort of personally comment on the coverage. I'd be very surprised if the claims that it was biased weren't accurate. I don't have any, I didn't do any study. I didn't even follow it as closely as I'm sure everyone would have done here. So I don't really sort of feel in a position to be able to comment on the BBC's output with any more authority, and probably less than everyone in this room.
There's a local context, which is we have an organisation called BBC Scotland, and basically surveys broadly indicate a great loss of confidence in that operation. So when you speak about defending the BBC, sort of regionally we think of, well, to what extent do we have faith or confidence that BBC Scotland can serve as a public broadcaster in this new arena, or this new environment?
Yeah,
so I think locally or regionally we have an issue which might be different in the perspective seen from where you are.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to an extent, when impartiality in Parliament, I mean, it seems very clear that the way the BBC construes impartiality is that they more or less defer to the state. And by the state, I don't want to be too vague about this. I mean the senior figures within the state and senior politicians, and it's very clear that both the main parties who they allowed to define impartiality were in favour of were against the referendum, and that was their point of reference. I don't know whether it will speak to your point enough, and I'm sort of conscious of coming to Scotland and then answering questions on Scotland by talking about England, but I just feel like more able to sort of talk about that. I mean, with the Corbyn stuff, which I think has real echoes of what happened in Scotland in terms of like radical mobilisation against the political establishment and the working class mobilisation, relatively speaking. It's very clear that the BBC was extremely hostile to Corbyn. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Panorama documentary that they did, but I wrote a piece on that, and actually, I think it's been very revealing in some ways, because you can look at the support that Corbyn has within the Labour Party, and you can look at the support he has in the parliamentary Labour Party, and it's very clear that the BBC has been balancing its coverage and orientation to the parliamentary Labour Party, not in orientation to the party itself. Well, political parties are funny things. They have one foot in the state and one foot in civil society, right? Now, if they were interested in representing the public, or let's say civil society organisations, which we can talk about, in a very sort of non-abstract way as being like a functional part of society outside of the state, they've been very clear on the Corbyn issue that isn't what they're going to do. That they consider impartiality to be still defined in Parliament. And I think, it's the British Broadcasting Company. I'd be very surprised if it didn't take a hostile position on that. And obviously it's...
it definitely violates its charter, but then again, we're not talking about what the charter says. I guess the last thing, and this is the general question about how to enforce change, the BBC is exempt from freedom of information requests. And I think that this is a place where perhaps there should be activism to wash that away and permit public access to the decision making that's going on within the BBC.
Yeah.
For the future.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, it's one of the characteristics of the BBC. I mentioned Tom Burns as a media sociologist. Well, he wasn't a media sociologist. He was a sociologist. He did an ethnographic study of the BBC. He called it public institution, private world. One of the characteristic features of the BBC was it's extremely suspicious of outside scrutiny, and part of that is a reflection of the precarious position that it finds itself vis-a-vis the politicians as much as anything else, but also that part of its culture, I think, going back to Reef, was that sort of condescension towards the public. Reef, like a lot of people of his class of that time, he was an admirer of fascism. He said it was great that the BBC didn't have any democratic process whatsoever, and that he thought this was a model for public bodies across the board. A lot of that stuff is built into the BBC, and I think also, if you look at its recruitment practices, people overwhelmingly coming from public school, overwhelmingly coming from Oxford and Cambridge. These are the institutions which socialise the British upper middle classes, and I think a lot of that stuff, that kind of suspicion of popular mobilisation and just people in general, and the idea of any sort of authentic participatory democracy, I think is built into the BBC's sort of institutional culture. And I totally agree about the editorial decisions. Look, I mean, I think there's the issue of governance, which is in terms of where the BBC sits in orientation to the British state, the power of appointments that governments have, which work their way down through the BBC. Like in a hierarchical organisation by the BBC, like the BBC, if you appoint someone at the head, it takes time, but they can change anything. I mean, I spoke to Greg Dyke during my thesis, and I said to him, how do you introduce change in an organisation like the BBC? He's a very candid guy. He's quite funny, actually. And he said, sorry, I'm just eating a biscuit, he said. And then he said, you hire a thug like Jeff Randall, and they'll do it. And that's what he did. He brought in Jeff Randall, and then he sort of like, oh, that was a bit of a joke. And then he said, you're Director General. If you say people will do it, these people... that's the kind of organisation the BBC is. And I think that there's the governance, and then there's the editorial power, which is at the heart of it. And I think what we need to be thinking about is first of all, the technological capacities that point towards a different model of broadcasting possibly, but opening up and democratising in some sort of fashion the editorial process, because that's really what, I think a democratic broadcaster should be about.
Great.
I mean, just a couple of things I'd say. I've got to go a little bit early, so what I would say is that thanks very much. Really great, and you raised some really very interesting points. Too many to go over, really. But there's a couple of things. One I'd say is that what was happening in the BBC in terms of its the attempts to control it and bring in the internal market and the impacts of that, particularly in relation to the laying of bureaucrats and administrators and controllers over the top. That wasn't just the BBC, that was, as you know, was obviously going on right across the public sector. So it was the health service, criminal justice system, the universities. So we experienced that micromanagement, that total control, the massive bureaucratisation, the person he referred to. And that is, I think, in part because although the neoliberal project was supposed to strip out, as you said, bureaucracy and supposed to have this internal market where everyone was wonderful, actually it was taking place in a situation where the governments, particularly the Tory ones, thoroughly distrusted the public sector and regarded it as bloated and and inefficient, and therefore attempted to layer it with accountants, auditors and controllers, and that negated any of the advantages that would have come from a freer market. In fact, you ended up with a massive overblown bureaucracy. And so that happened, I think, right across the society, not so much part of the theory of neoliberalism, but really a kind of loathing of the public sector by people within the state, by the political classes. But that was my reading of it. And as Chomsky said, I think correctly, the essential theory is that you allow the public sector to decay, and then once it's decayed, you privatise it, and you use that level of decay to argue for oh, well, look, it's not working, what we need is to sell it off, basically. So I think it's kind of, there's a stronger link to sort of crude political motivations in that sense, that could be made. I mean, I think the issue of Scotland is so complex, and what the media did in that, I don't think anybody would argue that the Daily Express and the Mail and the Telegraph were pretty well anti-independence. I think the issue of what the BBC did and what the media did is much more complicated than anything about it was biased one side or the other. I just come from a seminar on this now, 40 students, what percentage of the gross national product of Britain is constituted by the oil revenue. They were saying, 40% or 20%, and it's half of 1%, as you probably must know. And they were stunned by this. Not one single person got anywhere near it. And said, how can we possibly not have been told that? People never stopped talking about the oil, And I said, well, what percentage of international students wouldn't say that they would, or would be much less likely to come to Scotland if it became independent? Do you know that one? And they said, well, no. I said, well, it's 50%, which would lead to the closing down of large sections of Scottish universities. Why do you think that wasn't important? And I said, so you have a situation where there's both sides of the independence debate have a massive vested interest in not saying all kinds of things.
Just a comment, that data that was said into 50%, I'd like you to point to that study, because we looked at that, and that was actually a highly questionable data set. I'd be interested in reviewing that data from.
I looked at that data set, I thought it was very good. We'll discuss that later. I checked all the data before it was published, if you got the same data. The one that was in China Daily.
That's right.
No, I checked all that data. I had all the interviews, and I checked them and read them. I saw how they were conducted. I really made sure that was right, because I would stand by that data set, actually. I don't know why you thought it was wrong, but I thought it was absolutely.
The scale of the data set, how large the data set was.
See where you started?
No, I thought it was spot on.
The scale, the number of people actually queried.
Yeah.
Well, there was interviewed 300. I thought that was very good, and it exactly reflected everything that my classes of international students were saying. There was nothing that I came across to suggest that wasn't correct. Even if it had been 20%, it still would have been catastrophic. But it was actually 50. Right. Okay. Well, I'll hold that there.
Yeah. Okay. I've already resigned myself from the debate over the referendum. I mean, I'm really interested in it, so I'd love to hear more about it from people who know more about it than I do. Look, this question of the new public management and the institutional reforms that were introduced, these are obviously much broader than the BBC. The entire public sector has been subjected to them since the 1990s, first in Britain, New Zealand, and the United States, and then they've taken on sort of a new common sense, and a very dismal one at that. I mean, I think this is actually quite an important point, is I don't really quite agree with what you're saying, Greg. My main point was slightly different. Just that it's not that neoliberalism was a theory that we were going to have a free market and it was going to have cost savings and all of the rest of it, but then because of the intense distrust of the public sector, it took on this intensely bureaucratic and sort of coercive form. Actually, if you go back, because neoliberalism and the neoliberals were much more sophisticated than people give them credit for sometimes. I mean, just because they're sort of wrong on a lot of basic tenets, it doesn't mean that they didn't have a very sophisticated program. And if you go back to look at public choice in particular, now, public choice school is not usually recognised as being part of the neoliberal movement, but in actual fact, they were all part of the Montpellier Society, the people who founded that. So James Buchanan, who founded Public Choice, was a student at Chicago, was very close to Friedman. Actually, there's a really institutional history behind it all because they're at Virginia and they get chased off the campus by the New Left, and they go away to Virginia Tech, lick their wounds and create this sort of public choice society. Now, the point about this is that the neoliberals actually had a diagnosis of what was wrong with the crisis of capitalism in the 1970s. And the problem, as far as they were concerned, was the problem was the state. This was caused by the pathologies of the democratic state. And the solution that they came up with, particularly the public choice people, although it had different brands. I mean, you know, at the time, people focused a lot on monetarism because that was the basis on which there were public discussions. But in the background, there was a very well-developed political program to do with how we deal with the state, and public choice was particularly strong on that point. And what they said was that this was a crisis of the state, and the problem more or less was democracy, and that democracy needs to be disciplined. And in order for it to be disciplined, there's a very good book on this actually. Now, what is the guy's name? Alistair Roberts, called The Logic of Discipline. And you know, he points out that a lot of this stuff was rooted in that diagnosis in the 1970s, which the public choice people had. So you'll remember that trilateral curriculum paper. It's very famous, where they said that an excess of democracy had sort of threatened, put the whole system under threat. You know, their solution to this was more or less to a sort of an anti-politics. Like, you know, they questioned the idea that, first of all, that there was such a thing as a public good, that the government was capable of delivering the public good. So my point is that this suspicion of the public sector, it wasn't part of you know, an intense political antipathy coming from Westminster. This was deeply rooted in the neoliberal ideology, and I mean, I don't even like the word ideology in this concept, the neoliberal program, and they really grappled with the idea of how you would deal with the state and what place the state would have. And their solution, the public choice people, to what they saw as the pathologies of the democratic state, which they didn't believe in the public interest, which was central to a lot of the post-war liberalism and social democracy, and of course the BBC, because of public service broadcasting, was that you remodel the public sector in a way which would incentivize people to act and prevent the pathologies that they'd identified. So my point is, this isn't a side effect actually of neoliberalism. If you go back to what they're writing, it's absolutely there, and they're not anti-state either. I mean, that's why people get a bit confused on the BBC. It's absolutely true that they're trying to that they run down public services in order to privatise them. But it's also true that they retain a public infrastructure which allows them to siphon off public funds and line their pockets, which is exactly what happened with National Rail. I think if you read what the neoliberals actually write about the BBC, they don't really want to get rid of publicly funded broadcasting or publicly supported broadcasting. I mean, if you read the stuff like the Institute for Economic Affairs, right, you know, they want a commissioning system, more or less like Channel 4 without the public service obligations, where you can take public money and give it to companies. I mean, that's more or less what happened under Birtism, right? So they had 25% of their programs are being made by companies. You watch something on the BBC, it's made by an American corporation, and it's bought in by the BBC. So you pay your license fare money, and that goes to the private sector. You know, so Birtism was a process of privatization. And in terms of the disciplinary mechanisms that I was talking about, you know, these aren't a side effect of neoliberalism. Like, I think that's to mischaracterize what neoliberalism was trying to do. It was trying to introduce these kind of coercive disciplinary mechanisms. Now, obviously, they didn't go on TV and say, let's make your life a hell by introducing loads of paperwork. And, you know, the public kind of account that they gave was obviously much more watered down and much more romantic. But, I mean, I think it's there if you go back to the text. I mean, I don't know if that answers your question or criticism, but that's the way I see it.
Can I just interrupt? I should have said at the start, actually, I was too tired and rude, but I didn't introduce myself. I'm Vasiliki Kolokotroni. I'm based in English literature and I organize a series. So could I just say, before everybody speaks, could you just say who you are and, if it's appropriate, where you're based? Sorry, I
Dr.
didn't ask you.
Watson, School of Mathematics, University of Glasgow.
All right, okay, great.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Dr. Watson, School of Mathematics, University of Glasgow.
Mathematics class. First name?
Stephen.
Stephen Watson, great.
I'm Greg Filer and I run the appalling bad news series.
The shocking authority. Right, so.
Thanks. I'm also Stephen. That's all right. So Stephen White in politics. Much of the talk related to historical themes, general strike and that sort of thing. And I just wondered, we've had obviously the official history of the BBC, the Jean Seaton volume out recently, masses of memoirs, biographies and things of the sort. I just wonder how in particular you think the existing historiography is deficient. I mean, what can one hope now? Obviously one can rethink and so forth, but is there any particular criticism you'd like to offer of the received story?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems with Jean Seaton's account and some of the other official accounts is that, they are, she's doing an official history of the BBC as an institution. One of the things she doesn't have a good sense of is how the BBC relates to much broader, what was going on in the broader society, really. And she's very sentimental about that. If you she describes how, with the rise of Thatcherism, the mood of the country changed. There's no sort of reference to explain what's happening there. But I think one of the key things is that she doesn't really have a sense of how the BBC itself has been transformed over time, and that within the BBC, different interests within society play out within the BBC. So what I've tried to do in my research is to understand how different political agendas in the wider society have worked their way through the BBC. Now, for Jean Seaton, for example, when she's talking about the assaults that Thatcher had, the attacks that the Thatcherites were making on the BBC, she more or less, the question for her is, how did the BBC survive? That's the key point, because she sees the BBC as an institution in itself as being useful. Now, I think that's a slightly misleading question. I think the question has to be, to what extent does the sort of, is the ethos or purpose of the BBC, which it's supposed to deliver to us, been eroded by the process of change that it underwent? So, she just sees the BBC itself as an institution as being, of necessity, a public good. Now, in terms of new empirical material, I mean, it's very, very difficult to cover everything in one book. I mean, even, Jean Seaton's account, there's loads missing from it. I mean, I covered the 1970s, for example, looking at, say, the role that people like Greg had played, the rise of the New Left, the rise of neoliberalism. That's the way that I looked at it. She was doing an internal history of the corporation, and I mean, that's a slightly different thing. What I'm interested in is really how a whole process of wider social change influenced the BBC. I don't know if that really answers your question or not, but I mean, the BBC is a huge organisation, and there is, as with any official history, things get left out on the basis that they're seen as being important or less important. The one that springs to mind is MI5's official history. I remember when that came out, they didn't do anything on vetting, MI5's vetting of the BBC. And then they got criticised about that from David Lee, who said, this was hugely important, but I didn't include it. Anyway, he put it in his second edition. But of course, I think, obviously I'm coming at this from a more critical perspective, official histories are very useful in the sense that they, you will learn a lot from reading them. But I think her account was very deficient in a lot of ways. And, Seamus Milne has a really good account, a criticism of her account of how his father, Alistair Milne. So you know that Alistair Milne was fired at the BBC as Director General. His son is a journalist at The Guardian. And he wrote a very good article criticising her account and challenging it. I think there's a lot of that which could be done, which I hope to do some of which myself.
It's a very effective review.
Hello, my name is Vladimir Monkowski-Koric. I'm a newly lecturer in Central East European Studies, so this isn't my field, but obviously it's of great interest. And I very much liked your presentation. The only other similar presentation I went to, but was diametrically opposed in its argument, was by a certain Alan Sked, whom some of you may know. He's professor of history at the LSE, but in his previous life, in the early 90s, he was a fan of UKIP. He worked on Austria-Hungary and more recently on the United States and Abraham Lincoln and so on. But at some point I watched him deliver a paper on the history of Hollywood in the Cold War. And the secret behind Hollywood's success, he has revealed to us all, is actually it gave the consumer what he or she wanted. So this is a kind of a frequent argument, I think, that we hear about media, is what the consumer wants.
Yeah.
But I didn't hear much from you about whether that was the kind of language used to transform the BBC. In other words, what you've talked about is kind of power structures within it, but what about the kind of programming?
Yeah.
To what extent is the programming politically top-down, changed in a planned political way? To what extent does it reflect technological changes, or to what extent does it give the consumer what they want? Did you?
Sure. I mean, you know, the work that I've done has been on politics and journalism, so it's slightly different. You know, the ethos of journalism at the BBC or anywhere else, really, I mean, it's slightly different in a tabloid journalism, but it's never been this idea of giving the consumer what they want. A lot of the battles around the BBC have been centred more on popular programming, and you know that's the basis on which the BBC relies for a lot of its legitimacy. So my own account leaves out a lot that's really important. I mean, I think, you know, Murdoch and his attacks on the BBC and Thatcher's as well obviously used a lot of that rhetoric, the idea that the BBC was sort of patrician and they didn't trust the people. I mean, I think a lot of that was true. You know, I mean, they were, I think they were condescending. You know, and that did open up a lot of the possibilities for the neoliberals. I mean, of course, it's important to remember that the New Left had pioneered that sort of critique of bureaucracy before the neoliberals got on board with that anyway. A lot of the critiques of broadcasting that emerge out of 1968 were precisely on that basis, and that's the point at which the BBC starts to become attacked. In terms of delivering what the consumer wants, I mean, I think it's the thing is, cultural products, you don't know whether you want them until you've consumed them, you know, and it's a slightly strange thing in the sense that it's only after you've watched a film, for example, where you know whether you liked it. So you rely on, obviously, hearsay, which is how things which don't have a lot of financial backing get audiences. But generally, it's to do with the established corporate interests that are able to use circles of publicity to promote their material. And in terms of the BBC, actually, I think it's interesting the way News International now have been trying, I mean, very explicitly in the Green Paper, the Tories have been echoing the arguments being made by Murdoch and News International, which is basically that they can't compete because the BBC, too many people are using the BBC's public services. And what's really interesting about this is that they've reached a point where they're saying that the consumer should not be allowed to consume public services, because if people are given a choice, then they make the wrong choice and they go to something that's free, right? There's a real sort of irony here in that the government is saying we have to have subscription services because otherwise the corporations can't monetize cultural products. It seems to me that we've reached a point where at the BBC, if it weren't so integrated into the market, could produce an incredibly efficient system of cultural production where it would be publicly funded at the point of production and available completely freely. That's not something that a corporation like Sky can do because they need to exclude certain people in order to monetize the product. I mean, that's the thing with capitalism. You need to be able to, in order to monetize it, you can't have people producing it. And this comes back again to this thing of, this question of what is neoliberalism. I mean, free trade would mean that we're all allowed to trade a product that we can freely replicate. We'd all be able to be sharing stuff. But of course, the corporations have recognised correctly that if there is free trade in cultural goods, which are now for technological reasons infinitely, replicable, then they'd lose their money. And I also think, with other technical developments, there will be more opportunities for much more advanced forms of creative interaction with the BBC. I mean, look, I don't make a lot of prescriptions generally, you know, because I've just done like historical sociology basically. But it seems to me there's a huge potential to get past the market model and have freely available material, and that really the biggest obstacle to that is the corporations and, you know, the neoliberal mindset, which says that everything has to be a product, which basically means that everything has to be commodified, which means that people can't freely enjoy things, and that means that also, you know, people can't. So yeah, and that has an effect, I think, on our public life and the sort of horizons of our imagination as well.
Bridget.
I'm Bridget Fowler. I was in the sociology department and semi-retired. Again, I'd like to thank you for your presentation too. I totally agree with you that there are other ways of looking at the Creative Commons, which would be moving much more towards the sort of utopia that ultimately I would like. But as you quite rightly comment, the Charter is coming up for renewal next year. It does seem to me that there is yet further instalments of this massive attack on the BBC planned, which are extremely dangerous. And I feel that people should write in, 38 Degrees has had a petition, they should fill out that survey and say that they want to retain the BBC as it is. Now, I'm not under any illusions. I agree totally with what Stephen Watson said against Greg, who's going out of the room. I disagree with you, Greg, about the fairness of the referendum coverage. I think it was extremely biased, and I agree with you.
I'm interested only in the data. So John Robertson's report from the University of Scotland,
well, I definitely
definitive study.
The worst methodology I've ever seen in content. There's a study of, I've just done a seminar on it, but anyway.
Yeah.
Let's have another seminar.
And I think that the representation of the Syrian war has been very bad too. Largely, as you said, what has been omitted, what the West has omitted to do, particularly to support via weapons moderate, secular or radical groups in the Syrian war, is my view. But then you go to Australia or you go to America and you watch their television and it's horrific. It's interrupted with adverts about every 10 minutes, so you can't get a cohesive drama or anything. And it's a very low quality, and it doesn't have any of the, I have to say, occasionally very good programmes on the BBC. Like, for example, Moneybox did one on cooperatives, which was basically very much in favour of cooperatives, believe it or not. So if it were totally dominated by neoliberalism, it wouldn't have been able to put on that kind of programme. And I do think there's much more of a tension within the BBC than perhaps you have suggested in your very interesting presentation.
I think you're absolutely right. It's kind of difficult for me to give the whole picture in the time that I had, but it's very important. And, you know, I should have made this more clear. It's very important to realise that there's always pockets of resistance within the corporation. And in actual fact, you know, in the 1960s, that kind of golden age, and including during the Conservative term, the politics of the corporation itself reflected some of the politics in the wider society. So at the same time as, you know, Michael Swan was trying to stamp down on radicalism in the BBC, there were pockets of independent programme making. People were asking difficult questions to the establishment. That was going on. There were trade unions as well, which were much stronger at that stage in the BBC. So, for example, in 1973, there was a programme called, I think it was called like The People Speak or something like that. And the BBC had like 6 MPs on, and they were talking about how, you know, no one trusted politicians anymore. Anyway, but the audience just went mad at these politicians. And Michael Swan sent them a letter saying, we're very sorry about this. You know, we're trying to have a more civilised programme next week or something. And the programmes department sent those MPs a letter signed by 150 BBC producers saying, no, that we will not have another programme. And if you do, the 2 broadcasting unions will black out the programme. So the BBC was a site of struggle, And, you know, I absolutely agree. You know, it's really important to recognise that. And also, there are journalists working within the BBC who are trying to get good programmes made. You know, I mean, someone mentioned Paul Mason earlier, who, you know, sadly isn't at the BBC anymore. You know, there's an interesting history behind Paul Mason's appointment, because Newsnight was kept slightly separate from the news and current affairs machine. It was like before, in the BBC in the 1970s, sorry, I'll try and be quick. The BBC in the 1970s, each programme had its own editors who worked on the programmes and its own specialists. So they were more like a law unto themselves. And what Birt did was he merged the whole thing together, and then he had a huge pool of correspondents who then had to sell their expertise to programmes. So, you know, you listen to the Day programme and you hear people coming on who work for the BBC. This is the BBC such and such a correspondent. They're trying to sell their programmes and get on programmes. That's how Birt divided it up. It was made so that you wouldn't have an independent person, and you wouldn't. So you could find a situation in the 1970s where if you get your boss more or less might protect you from the BBC establishment, you could make critical programmes. You know, that did happen. And now, and obviously, I don't want the BBC to be further commercialised, and that is, you know, there's absolutely no doubt what interests the government represents. I mean, who could possibly doubt it? You know, Cameron wrote for the Sun in like 2008, I think it was, you know, about how, you know, the BBC was threatening innovation and through its online expansion and all the rest of it. You know, it's very clear. We know what everybody knows now. I mean, the left has always known what interests Murdoch and his, you know, gangster capitalists represent. But now everybody knows that these people are crooks, and they also know that the government works for them. I mean, look at, you know, attitudes to government now, and of course we don't want it like we don't want. Nobody, I think, even in the BBC and even the Conservatives, wants the kind of media that they have in the United States. I mean, probably a few crazies like Michael Gove, you know, banging on about, you know, we need to make The Wire or something. You know, what is he talking about? I mean, but nobody really wants that. A lot of Conservatives are pretty proud of the BBC. You know, on the one hand, yes, it does make some good critical programmes. On the other hand, from a Conservative perspective, you know, it sort of performs a function for them around the world. You know, it's a symbol of prestige for the government. So it's not only a site of struggle for you know, people with the sort of values which I imagine that we all share, but it's also a site of contestation, you know, within the elite as well. I mean, Willie Whitelaw, who was, you know, he protected the BBC from Thatcher. He wasn't a one nation Conservative, but he was a bit more sensible than, you know, Norman Tebbit and people like that. He recognised the value of the BBC and kept Thatcher at bay for a little while. So, you know, I don't want to give the impression that, you know, the BBC is this sort of terrible, you know, irredeemable neoliberal institution. The reason it sounds like that is because I just don't think it's recognised enough anyway, right? I mean, I'm not saying that it's irredeemable, but it's certainly not, you know, the sort of exemplary public service broadcaster that its defenders imagine it is. And I think the danger is if we keep on the back foot, you know, the left has been on the back foot on the BBC since, like, you know, well, I think 1984 at least, you know, and haven't really come up with a new idea. And I think if we can't go on, if we can't take the initiative, there's just not going to be anything left to defend. You know, the BBC will be a complete neoliberal state bureaucracy. Even private companies have sites of resistance, you know, for journalists. I mean, CNN can publish good stuff. I mean, you know, if you have people with conscience, they find ways of negotiating these organisations. But and it is possible to do that in the BBC, but I think it's exaggerated the extent to which it is possible.
Just to follow on from that point, I mean, I wonder if it's worth saying something about the Dyke era in that respect, because it was a kind of contradictory era, because of course, as soon as he came in, it was always said that Birt wanted to make the BBC the most efficient organisation in the world, and of course Dyke wanted to make the BBC the most creative organisation in the world. I actually worked under Dyke. He was a hugely charismatic figure. One of the first things he did when he got in was to actually undo a lot of the changes that Birt had introduced. Morale went up, you know, staff felt differently. For instance, Andrew Gilligan, I think, was a hire which he was deliberately put in place to undertake more challenging journalism, to really turn on its head the real monitoring that you talked about under the Birt era. I mean, a lot of the people in this room will know how that worked out, so maybe it cemented the general argument that you're making, but I do think that I mean, Dyke was a period of real hope for people that worked in the BBC, and I think in terms of the programming and the investigative journalism as well. So that argument about it not being a linear process and it being a site of struggle, and also look at the way the staff responded when Dyke was forced to resign. I mean, that shows you something about what's going on at the lower level as well. I mean, you have the BBC being establishment, your Oxbridge, and these kind of the institutionalisation of the people at the very top, but actually the rest of the staff don't necessarily feel that way. I know I certainly didn't, and I don't come from that kind of a background. We were there because we believed in making decent programming, and we believed absolutely in the BBC, which I do to this day, although I take on board all the criticisms that have been made of it.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether the Dyke era, as I say, it's contradictory, because obviously the outcome was overwhelmingly negative, actually, and it's weakened the BBC ever since, I strongly believe, the charter in 2010. So.
No, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Dyke, from the perspective of business journalism, he was a millionaire. He was probably not interested in ideas enough to be a neoliberal, but he pretty much accepted all of that sort of common sense, which, New Labour has accepted. He was very close to Blair as well, so there was that. But you're right. I mean, he's pretty scathing about Birt in his autobiography, and he doesn't say most efficient. Actually, the quote was best managed. The Birt wanted to make BBC the best managed organisation in the world, and Dyke says, that's not going to get me out of bed in the morning. I want it to make good programmes, and I think that was really important. But part of the problem was, obviously, as you say, we know where that ended up. I mean, I think it was even more contradictory, because I think actually, he was a figure who was very close to Blair, and he had sort of accommodated all of that that common sense, if you like. And as I said, he was a millionaire, but he was a very likable figure, and he was much more amiable than Birt, who, by all accounts, was just an arsehole. And he did make a difference, but he didn't stay there very long. I mean, this shows you ultimately that this, comes back to that point of struggle, doesn't it? It's like there is a degree of freedom. The BBC had always operated in this grey area of a sort of ambiguous autonomy. Well, we know what happened is the government went after the BBC ferociously, and they decapitated it. And they didn't just decapitate it, they decapitated with it, the vision and the idea of what the BBC could be making good programmes, right? And that was obviously very demoralising. And instantly, as soon as they went, they introduced new programme control processes as a result of Hutton. And I think there's another important point about, Gilligan, you're right, was appointed because the BBC had traditionally been seen as too close to the Ministry of Defence. But it's interesting, the reason why Today, which he worked for, run that programme was that its editor at the time was Kevin Marsh, who is very enthusiastic about business news. I mean, he also plays quite a role in that. He really pushed for business news on the Today programme. He went with John Humphreys to meet the head of MI6 shortly before they broadcast that programme. The head and deputy head of MI6 asked them, what do you think the reaction would be if there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? We're just wondering. And they went away from that meeting knowing that the intelligence organisations were very sceptical about the information which had been put out there. Now, Gilligan forms the impression from Kelly that basically the intelligence organisations don't like what's going on. Actually, it turns out the head of the intelligence organisations, the spooks might not like it, but the heads who are close to Tony Blair do. And it's a very similar thing, I think, with the BBC at some stage. You get contestation within the state as well as outside of it. But sorry, my central point was going to be one of the reasons Today runs that critical story that Gilligan runs is because they were briefed by members of the establishment. But it goes to show you how short a leash the BBC is kept on when you get briefed by MI6 and members of the cabinet, as Claire Short. You run a story which, for all intents and purposes, was completely correct. I mean, they did get elements of it wrong. I mean, principally, the extent to which the intelligence organisations were complicit in what had happened. But I mean, how do you report? This comes back to your question about MI5. How do you corroborate stuff like that? He had an impeccable source, and apart from one slip-up, it was more or less a correct story, and look what happened. So yeah, absolutely a site of struggle, but a site of struggle which is absolutely hugely weighed against us. That's the important thing to understand, I think, about the BBC and the media, is it's not a sort of neoliberal monolith in which there's no contestation, but it's also not some sort of like even playing field. You're able to get critical perspectives through by navigating these kind of things and by creating pockets of resistance, and of course by organisation within the organisation, amongst staff, and that's why unionisation was so important, against management. But I think that episode really showed the extent to which, if the government went for the BBC, I mean, we all know what happened. The story's familiar, so I won't go over it.
Right, can I say we've gone over 7 o'clock.
It was a humorous remark. It wasn't a question.
All right.
So just a
final comment.
So actually, I'm interested in this historical arc you're describing, and how by the end of the 70s, early 80s, a transition away from editorial freedom, editorial control occurred. I had by accident recently been watching not the 9 o'clock news, a political satire show from the late 70s, which for those who have not heard of it, I would strongly recommend looking at YouTube, where you recognise and you see, and watching it from today's perspective, how free they were to mock the establishment and go after the political figures in a way that, of course, looking at today, you're shocked at the freedoms. So indeed, right there.
I had the same experience, watching stuff from YouTube that went on the BBC. I mean, Granada's stuff was much better, actually, by comparison. I mean, MI5 wrote a report on BBC News and Current Affairs in like 77 or something, and they said that there's no communists there, they're basically sensible in the BBC. But, Granada was another matter, it was overrun with trots, and, they need to, and, it was more or less correct, I think. They were more radical. But, the whole media look to each other, don't they? And I think, Panorama to some extent became more radical as a result of, those trots. So.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Thank you for your comments and questions and your contributions. Special thanks to Tom for a very illuminating and engaging account. So, if you're watching more BBC to trace exactly where it's going. But thank you very much, Tom, again, for a wonderful